American independence couldn't have been won without three men: George Washington, who was the army commander; Benjamin Franklin, who convinced the France to help America; and Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution.
Robert Morris.
Robert Morris.
Robert Morris.
Robert Morris was born on January 31st, 1734, in Liverpool, Great Britain, to a family of merchants doing business with colonial America. Unfortunately, Robert lost his mother at the young age of 2, leaving only his father to tend to him. Since his father's business was booming, the two of them decided to relocate to Pennsylvania to be more central to their merchant operations. At the age of 13, Robert finally began his education in Philadelphia. But young Robert was too quick for his teacher, and one day while he was talking with his father about his teacher, he declared to his father, "Sir, I have learned all that he can teach me." In 1750, Robert Morris's father, Robert Morris Sr., put on a dinner party on board one of the company's ships. As he left the ship in a small boat, a farewell salute was fired from the ship, and wadding from the shop burst through the side of the boat, severely injuring him. And as a result of that accident, he died of blood poisoning on July 12, 1750, leaving young Robert an orphan at the age of 15 years old. He was soon apprenticed to the counting room of Charles Willing at the age of 16. 2 years later, his employer died, and Morris entered into a partnership with the gentleman's son. In the next 39 years, that business flourished, and Robert Morris's wealth and his reputation were well secured. Being an importer, his business was hard hit by the Stamp Act, and Robert led the street protest against it. Robert and his partner engaged in the movements against the British rule. Their company brought in weaponry and powder for the militia, along with information about English troop movements. Robert Morris married Mary White on March 2nd, 1769, and they had 7 children. After being elected to the Continental Congress in 1775, Robert found himself on many committees to raise money and provisions for the Continental Army. Early in 1776, he was given authority to negotiate bills of exchange and to solicit money by other means for the operations of the war. On the 4th of July, 1776, Robert Morris would sign the Declaration of Independence at the age of 44. He said at that time that it was the duty of every individual to act his part in whatever station his country may call him to in hours of difficulty, danger, and even distress. Well, from that moment forward until peace was finally achieved in 1783, Morris performed the services in support of the war. Robert Morris was one of only 2 founding fathers to have signed all 3 major founding American documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution. In late 1776, with the Continental Army in the state of severe deprivation because of the shortage of capital and the failure of several of the colonies in paying for the war, Morris received a letter from General George Washington needing $10,000. Morris knew of no one who possessed the required money or who would be willing to even lend it. Well, that evening, as he was returning back home, he met with an honest Quaker with whom he had been acquainted. The Quaker asked of the news, and Mr. Morris told him of this letter. The Quaker friend said, "Sir, you must let me have it. My note and my honor will be your only security. You shall have it." Wow. The money was soon sent to Washington, who provisioned his desperate troops, who went on to win the Battle of Trenton. In 1777, Morris returned to Congress and signed the country's first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Morris retired from Congress in 1778 and rejoined the Pennsylvania Assembly. While in that body, he worked to establish the checks and balances and to protect minority rights. The Continental Congress called Morris to service again in 1781, appointing him as the Superintendent of Finance, an office then for the first time established. This appointment was unanimous. He devised a plan for a national bank whose principal object was to supply the Army with provisions, and submitted it to the Congress. It was approved and became the Bank of North America, an institution that brought stability to the colonial economy, facilitated continued finance of the war effort, and would ultimately establish the credit of the United States with the nations of Europe. Morris was immediately appointed as finance agent, meaning the Secretary of Treasury of the United States, in order to direct the oppositions of this brand new bank. Following the war, he served in the Pennsylvania legislature and was also a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and thereafter an advocate for our brand new Constitution. He was then sent as a senator for Pennsylvania when that Constitution was ratified. In 1789, President George Washington appointed Morris Secretary of Treasury, but he declined the office and suggested that Alexander Hamilton take the position instead. Morris completed his office as senator, and then he retired from public service. He never recovered the wealth that he once enjoyed before the Revolution. What was left of the fortune was soon lost to land speculation in the western part of New York State. Robert died of asthma on May 8, 1806. Reverend Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Robert Morris, "From the foregoing short statement, we may have some idea of the nature and the magnitude of service rendered by Mr. Morris to the United States. It may be truly said that few men acted a more conspicuous or useful part. And when we recollect that it was by his exertions and his talents that the United States were so often relieved from their difficulties at times of great depression and pecuniary distress, an estimate may be formed of the weight of obligations due to him from the people of the present day." Robert Morris was a genius in the world of finance. Even today, we still use many of the things that he put into place. Wow, I wish and I hope that I can take care of my money as well as he took care of his. It will be impossible to enumerate all or even a small part of the experiments which were made by Dr. Franklin. But justice requires us to say that he seldom wrote or discoursed on any subject upon which he did not throw light. Few men possessed more penetrating genius or a happier faculty of discrimination.
Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 17, 1706. His father, Josiah Franklin, was a soap and a candle maker and had 17 children, and Benjamin was the 15th child and the last son. At an early age, he soon had a reputation of respectable genius, but his parents couldn't afford the expenses of college, and so they kept him home to do his father's business. He made candles for 2 years, but became so bored. He wanted to go and get a job on a ship so that he could be on the sea. His parents kind of hated that idea since they had already lost one son to the sea. When Benjamin was just 12 years old, his father apprenticed him to his elder brother in 1717, who was a printer. Being around so many books, he soon began writing. At age 16, Benjamin asked his brother to pay him half the cost to board him, and he would board himself, using the leftover money to purchase the books that he wanted. Well, since his brother had a newspaper, the New England Current, Benjamin published his first article there anonymously in 1721, and he adopted the pseudonym Miss Silence Dogood. Her 14 imaginative and witty letters were highly commended by the people, with the best judgment and the best taste in town, which caused Benjamin to feel his importance. But his brother James was angry when he discovered that these letters were Benjamin's. Since James was a harsh taskmaster and treated Benjamin poorly, Ben was determined to leave. He secretly boarded a ship and made his way to Philadelphia, where he arrived tired, with no money, and only 17 years old. Benjamin wandered through the streets of the city, and his ragged appearance got him noticed by many, including the woman who would be his wife. He obtained employment in one of the 2 printing offices in Philadelphia. The governor also noticed him and became interested in his welfare and cared for him. The governor urged him to return back to Boston, which Benjamin did, and came to the house of his father and was affectionately received by his family. The governor proposed Franklin to go to England and to purchase the necessary materials for a printing establishment. Benjamin accepted that offer with much gratitude, and he sailed for England in 1725. Upon arriving in England, he learned, however, the governor had tricked him. His letter and the credit were worthless. So he became an apprentice, again, to earn the money that he was going to need. He learned the good and the evil that life had to offer. And he chose to write and influence his friends that a warm and a nourishing breakfast was better than the stimulating liquors, unquote. Well, after a year and a half in London, he came home to Philadelphia late in 1726. Franklin returned only to find that Deborah Reed, whom he had promised to marry upon his return, had already gotten married. Well, in the next few years, he held a variety of jobs such as bookkeeper, shopkeeper, currency cutter, and Franklin was finally able to set up his own shop as a printer and started a new public paper. And because of his skill as a writer and printer, it caused the paper to succeed. He was also able to take Deborah Reed as his wife in 1730, after her husband disappeared. Franklin's prominence and success grew in the 1730s with the publication of Poor Richard's Almanac at the end of 1732, which continued for 25 years. In 1744, the French War, he proposed a plan of voluntary association for the defense of the country. He was shortly joined by 10,000 who were trained in using weapons. Franklin was chosen as the colonel, but he refused in favor of being a member of the Provincial Assembly, where he was re-elected for the next 10 years. Benjamin was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1751 and served as an agent for Pennsylvania to England, France, and 3 other European powers. He was elected to the Continental Congress in 1775, where he played a crucial role in the rebellion against Great Britain and in editing the Declaration of Independence. Franklin was celebrated throughout Europe, welcomed in any royal court, sought out by prestigious societies. Indeed, Franklin was worshipped wherever his name was known. In 1757 to 1762, Franklin returned to England once more. He was granted $5,000 and a seat in the Provincial Assembly of Pennsylvania in gratitude for all that he had accomplished on that trip. In 1766 and 67, he made an excursion to Holland, Germany, and France, where he met with the most flattering and distinguished reception. He met Louis XV and was introduced to other members of the royal family, where he was treated with great hospitality and courtesy. He was elected as a member of the French Academy of Sciences. In 1775, Franklin was elected to the Second Continental Congress, and as a Postmaster General for the colonies, having mapped the postal routes in 1762. And in 1776, he was one of the 5 men to draft the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Franklin was finally able to sign the document at the age of 70. He was the oldest signer. After almost a decade in France, Franklin returned back home to America in 1785 and was welcomed home with the ringing of bells, the discharge of artillery, and the acclamations of thousands. He often spoke of this time with great pleasure. In fact, he said, quote, "I am now in the bosom of my family, and I find 4 new little prattlers who cling about the knees of their grandpapa and afford me great pleasure. I am surrounded by my friends, and I have an affectionate, good daughter and son-in-law to take care of me. I have got into my niche, a very good house, which I built 24 years ago, and out of which I have been ever since kept by foreign employments," unquote. He didn't get to stay there long, as he was appointed president of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, an office that he held for 3 years. During the Federal Convention of 1787, he was elected as a delegate. He bore a distinguished part in organizing the Constitution of the United States. Benjamin Franklin died on April 17, 1790, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the home of his daughter, Sarah Batch. He was 84. He suffered from gout and had complained about his declining health for quite some time. Franklin had actually written his epitaph when he was 22 years old. Here it is: "The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old worn-out book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author. In his will, he directed no monumental ornaments should be placed upon his tomb, a small marble slab only, and that too on the level with the surface of the earth, bearing the name of himself and his wife and the year of his death. That is what marks the spot in the yard where he lies, which simply reads, Benjamin and Deborah Franklin, 1790. Congress directed a general mourning for him throughout the United States for the space of a month. The National Assembly of France testified their sense of loss, which the world sustained by decreeing that each member should wear mourning for 3 days. This was an honor perhaps never before paid by the National Assembly of one country to the citizen of another country. Reverend Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Benjamin Franklin, "In the early part of his life, he acknowledged himself to have been skeptical in religion, but he became in maturer years, according to the testimony of his intimate friend Dr. William Smith, a believer in divine revelation." The following extract from his memoirs, written by himself, deserves to be recorded here, and I quote, "Here let me with all humility acknowledge that to divine providence I am indebted for the felicity I have hitherto enjoyed. It is that power alone which has furnished me with the means that I have employed, and that has crowned them with success. My faith in this respect leads me to hope, though I cannot count on it, that the divine goodness will still be exercised towards me, either by prolonging the duration of my happiness to the close of my life, or by giving me the fortitude to support any melancholy reverse which may happen to me as well as to many others. My future fortune is unknown but to Him, in whose hand is our destiny, and who can make our very afflictions subservient to our benefit." With so many of America's heroes, Successes seem to always take the spotlight, while failures are rarely mentioned. Dr. Franklin said, "Do not fear mistakes, you will know failure. Continue to reach out." Benjamin Franklin took his own advice and he explored many professions: businessman, writer, publisher, scientist, diplomat, legislator, soldier at the age of 42, a social activist. He mapped the Gulf Stream, invented swim fins, and created the first American public library and the first American fire station, founding universities and libraries, the post office, shaping foreign policy for our fledgling United States, drafting the Declaration of Independence, publishing newspapers, warming us with the Franklin stove, and inventing chimneys, pioneering advances in science, letting us see with bifocals, and yes, even lighting our way with electricity and the invention of the lightning rod. He invented musical instruments such as the harmonica, and his last public act was to sign a memorial to Congress recommending the abolition of slavery, all from a man who never finished school, but shaped his life through the abundant reading and experience, a strong moral compass, and an unfledgling commitment to civic duty, and an overall wit, good humor, and integrity. His self-education earned him honorary degrees from Harvard, Yale, Oxford in England, and St. Andrews in Scotland. What more can you say about a man like that? I have loved learning about Benjamin Franklin, and in fact, I have a story for you. Here in Reverend Charles Augustus Goodrich's book, he tells about an experiment that Benjamin Franklin does on his mother. "The hour will yet come when my vote in favor of American independence will be the most illustrious act of my life."
John Morton.
John Morton.
John Morton.
John Morton was born in Ridley, Pennsylvania, 1725. Unfortunately, his father died just a few months before his birth. John's intelligence and his good work ethic was noticed very early on by those around him. After John's mother remarried, his new stepfather, who was a very well-educated gentleman from England, was able to teach young John everything he knew in the comfort of their own home. Now this served John very well as he became a surveyor, a farmer, a professor of religion, and a politician. In 1748, John met the love of his life, Anne Justice, and the pair decided to get married. They would go on to have 8 children together, and John proved to be a wonderful, kind, loving husband and father. In 1756, Mr. Morton was elected to the Provincial Assembly. In 1764, he was commissioned as a Justice of the Peace and sent as a delegate to the General Assembly of Pennsylvania. He was an active member for very many years, and for some time was even the Speaker of the House of Representatives. In 1766, he was appointed as High Sheriff of the county in which he lived, and he held that office for 3 years. Then he was elevated to the bench as the presiding judge of the Superior Court of Pennsylvania. One of John Morton's most important public acts was to change his vote from no to yes in the support of the Declaration of Independence on July 2nd. Mr. Morton found himself in a very difficult situation. Previous to July 4th, the states of Delaware and Pennsylvania had voted in opposition to the Declaration of Independence and expected their representatives to vote accordingly. Fortunately, the votes of both of these states were cast in favor of independence, but the delegation from Pennsylvania were equally divided, and it fell to Mr. Morton to give his final deciding vote. Now, Mr. Morton was a man of firmness and decision, and in that spirit, he cast his vote in favor of liberty and of his country. He signed that Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, about the age of 51. Considering his situation that he was in, Mr. Morton deserves to be remembered with respect by the free and the independent people of America. The following year, he caught a terrible fever, and in a few days, he died in his 52nd year. His only enemies were those who wouldn't forgive him for his vote in favor of independence. And at the hour of his death, he remembered those unforgiving people, and he asked those at his bedside, please tell them, the hour will yet come when my vote in favor of American independence will be the most illustrious act of my life. Unquote. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of John Morton, Mr. Morton was a professor of religion and a truly excellent man. To the poor he was ever kind, and to the affectionate family consisting of a wife, 3 sons, and 5 daughters, he was an affectionate husband and father. So my question is this: do we stand by our word? When we say something, do we really mean it? Or is our word something like a pie crust, easily made, easily broken? Well, John Morton stood by his word, and he was firm to what he believed. George Clymer narrowly escaped death from a tomahawk when he accidentally took a route which led him into an area where savage Indians had recently murdered a man. George would have been at that very place had he not chosen a different road at the last minute.
George Clymer.
George Clymer.
George Clymer.
George Clymer was born March 16, 1739 in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, both of George's parents died by the time he was 7, leaving him an orphan. His uncle, William Coleman, gave him a good education and taught him to love reading. George apprenticed in his uncle's counting room to prepare for a career as a merchant. However, he didn't enjoy the family business as much as he enjoyed reading and science. Through all of his studies, George became well-versed in law, farming, fine arts, history, and politics. Though he was capable of teaching, he seemed only interested in more learning. After finishing up his apprenticeship with his uncle, George went into the merchant business for himself, despite his lacking passion for that. He did, however, find that the work left him plenty of time to read and to enjoy learning what he wanted to learn. On March 22nd, 1765, George married the love of his life, Elizabeth Meredith, and the pair went on to have 5 children together. George found himself in opposition to the British rule very early on, since he foresaw the overwhelming influence they would soon implement. He was a patriot leader in the Tea Act and the Stamp Act, and as a member of the Philadelphia Council of Safety in 1775 and one of the first Continental Treasurers. He was elected to the Continental Congress in 1776 and served there for several years. During this time, George signed the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of 38. 1777 was a big year for Mr. Clymer. He was sick, and he needed time for recovery. That year, his family was attacked by a band of British soldiers while they were living just outside of Philadelphia. The furniture in the house and many of the other items in the house were destroyed. Fortunately, the family made their escape into the woods nearby while the British ransacked their home. The intention was to tear down the entire house, but they changed their mind when they learned that the house didn't even belong to the Clymer family. And Mr. Clymer was in Philadelphia at the time. Also that year, Mr. Clymer was to go to Pittsburgh with the mission of reaching an agreement with several of the Indian tribes in that country and to enlist the warriors into the service of the United States. On this trip, George narrowly escaped death from a tomahawk when he accidentally took a route which led him into an area where savage Indians had recently murdered a man. George would have been at that very place had he not chosen a different road at the last minute. In 1784 to 88, he was a member of the legislature of his native state, working to form a more efficient constitution for the general government. His last national public duty was a mission to the Cherokees and the Creek Indians in Savannah, Georgia. In 1805, he was elected first president of Philadelphia Bank, first president of the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, and the vice president of the Philadelphia Agricultural Society. He held all of these positions until his death on the 23rd of January, 1813, at the age of 73. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of George, "He excused himself from nothing that belonged to his office. He neglected nothing. He never once omitted to attend a meeting of the directors unless prevented by sickness or absence from the city, and these exceptions were very rare occurrence. He was indeed the first to come, and so the board never waited for a moment for their president." Wow. Punctuality is one of the most important traits. Being where you say you're going to be, when you say you're going to be there. How valuable are the important examples of these founding fathers? So grateful to learn about these great men. James Smith remained in Congress for several years, where he was always active and efficient, and by his cheerful and interesting stories, he dispelled the loss of courage and hope, which he often saw all around him.
James Smith.
James Smith.
James Smith.
James Smith was born in Dublin, Ireland on September 17, 1719. He immigrated to Cheshire County, Pennsylvania with his family when he was 10 or 12 years old. His father was a successful farmer, and James benefited from a good, simple, classical education. He excelled in the art of surveying, which at this period of time in the country was a very useful thing. He later studied law and became a lawyer and a surveyor, and he continued the practice of those professions for the remainder of his life. He attended a provincial assembly in 1774, where he was appointed to a committee to come up with a plan to stop importing any products from Britain. He presented a paper he had written called Essay on the Constitutional Power of Great Britain over the Colonies in America. Whew. The essay suggested a boycott of the British goods and a general congress of the colonies as measures in defense of the colonial rights. Well, later in that year, he organized a voluntary militia. It was a company in opposition to the armies of Great Britain, and they elected him as their captain. His company, 1 to 200 men, later grew to be a battalion, 500 or more, at which point he deferred the leadership to a younger man. He was still appointed their colonel, but the title was honorary as he never assumed the actual command. James was appointed to the Provincial Convention in Philadelphia in 1775, where he stated, quote, "If the British administration should determine by force to effect a submission, we hold it our indispensable duty to resist that force at every hazard to defend the rights and the liberties of America," unquote. A greater portion of Pennsylvania were strongly opposed not only to war, but even to the idea of a Declaration of Independence. James Smith was elected to the Continental Congress in 1776. He arrived after July 2nd vote for independence, but he still arrived in time to place his signature on the document on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of 56. James remained in Congress for several years, where he was always active and efficient. And by his cheerfulness, He dispelled the loss of courage and hope which he often saw around him. In 1778, he resumed his professional career, being no longer interested in a political career. James had served in many public offices, one term in the State Assembly, a few months as a judge in the State High Court of Appeals. He was re-elected to Congress in 1785, but declined to attend due to his advancing age. Little is known about his professional work because a fire destroyed his office and his papers in early 1806. And later in that same year, James died on July 11th, 1806, at the age of 87. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of James Smith, "In his disposition and habits, Colonel Smith was very peculiar. He was distinguished for his love of anecdote and conviviality. His memory was uncommonly retentive and remarkably stored with stories of humorous and diverting character, which, on occasion, he related with great effect." In other words, he was a fabulous storyteller who could lighten a heavy situation with an interesting story. George Taylor married the newly widowed mother, assumed ownership of the entire company for 10 years until his stepson became of age. George then passed the ownership back to the rightful heir of the estate. Now that is a definition and an example of integrity.
George Taylor.
George Taylor.
George Taylor.
George Taylor was born in 1716 in Ireland to a clergyman. Not finding the life that he was seeking in Ireland, George decided that he would immigrate to America about the age of 20 years old. Unfortunately, George had no money that he needed to pay for the expenses of the trip. Well, a man named Mr. Savage, who owned a very large ironworks company, Warwick Furnace and Coventry Forge, paid for George's trip under the condition that George would be hired to throw coal into the furnace at his factories. After realizing George's intelligence, Mr. Savage moved him into the counting room as a clerk, where he was much happier and much more useful. 6 years after George's arrival in Philadelphia, Mr. Savage died, leaving behind a widow and a small family. Soon after his death, George married the widowed mother and assumed ownership of the entire company for a while. 10 years later, when his stepson became of age, George then passed the ownership back to the rightful heir of the estate. In that decade, however, George had built a fortune for himself and a large mansion in Northampton, which became his permanent home. Without a furnace or a forge of his own, George went out and found the Durham Ironworks, which was available for lease at the time. George jumped at the chance to set up his own business, and he continued in his profession. George Taylor was elected to the Provincial Assembly for Pennsylvania in 1764 and was re-elected for the next 5 years. During his time in this role, he was a member of the committee to draft the instructions of Pennsylvania delegates to the First Continental Congress, a member of the Committee of Correspondence and of the Committee of Safety. In 1774, George was able to join his two jobs when he became the first supplier of munitions to the Continental Army. Just 2 years later, in 1776, George elevated his political career to the federal level when he joined the Continental Congress. And luckily, he was just in time to sign the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of about 60. He served Congress through 1777. He was then elected to the new Supreme Council of his state. But he served there for only 6 weeks, apparently due to illness. There was no record of any public service afterwards. He died in 1781 at the age of 65. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of George Taylor, The happiness of these colonies has been our first wish. Their reconciliation with Great Britain, our next. Ardently, we have prayed for the accomplishment of both, but if we must renounce one or the other, we humbly trust in the mercies of the Supreme Governor of the universe, that we shall not stand condemned before his throne. Integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, the state of being whole and undivided. He just wanted the best for every situation and every person. Integrity is doing what is right just because it's right. Letters. Have you thought about how important that they are? James Wilson carried a number of valuable letters of recommendation with him, and through these connections, his life was changed.
James Wilson.
James Wilson.
James Wilson.
James Wilson was born on September 14th, 1742 in Scotland. He attended a number of universities in the area where he grew up and received an excellent education. After completing his studies, he decided to immigrate to America in search of the freedom he knew he couldn't find in Scotland. He immigrated to America in 1766, carrying with him a number of valuable letters of recommendation. Through these connections, he began tutoring and then teaching at Philadelphia College, and he enjoyed a reputation of being the best classical scholar in the Latin department of the college. While having proved his knowledge in the field, James asked for a degree and was awarded an honorary Master's of Arts degree. The most popular career in the field of those days was, of course, law. So James received an offer of entering the study of law. After 2 years of hard work, he attained the bar in Philadelphia. His office was very successful, and he managed to earn a small fortune in the few short years. From a very early age, Mr. Wilson was very patriotic towards his brand new American home. He was an American from principle from the moment he landed on our American shores. In 1775 to 77 and 1785 to 87, he was elected to the Continental Congress. James Wilson's power of speech and passion and his delivery were commented on favorably by many members of the Congress. He was, however, in kind of a tough situation. Pennsylvania was divided on the issue of separating from Britain, and when the vote came, he was able to grant Pennsylvania's wish for independence. Later on, he was able to sign the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, about the age of 34. In June of 1779, Mr. Wilson was appointed by France to serve as its U.S. advocate for general maritime and commercial enterprises. Mr. Wilson was held in a very high estimation, and that is confirmed in letters from the King of France. The duties of his office were both difficult and delicate, and few men were better qualified for such an office than Mr. Wilson. In 1781, there were difficulties as to the manner in which he should be paid for his services, and he ultimately resigned his commission, but continued to give advice and to minister to France. In 1781, Wilson was appointed a director of the original Bank of North America. In 1783, he was appointed by the President and the Supreme Executive Council in the great controversy between that state and the state of Connecticut, relating to certain lands within the charter boundary of Pennsylvania. Well, they voted in favor of Pennsylvania thanks to the determination of Mr. Wilson and the impressive argument which he delivered before the court, which occupied several days. Mr. Wilson was a member of the celebrated Convention of 1787, which was assembled in Philadelphia for the purpose of forming the Constitution of the United States. He was a fluent speaker, and he did much to settle upon just principles and important points. On the 23rd of July, the convention resolved that a committee consisting of Wilson, Rutledge, Randolph, Gorham, and Ellsworth, who reported the draft of the Constitution. When the time came to ratify the Constitution, Mr. Wilson returned as a member of that body, and it fell upon him to explain the principles upon which it was founded. He again was powerful in getting the Constitution ratified in that state. In 1789 to 1798, General George Washington appointed Mr. Wilson a judge of the Supreme Court of the United States under the federal Constitution. He was in this office until his death, August 21st, 1798, at the age of 55. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of James, "Towards all with whom he had friendship from abroad, he was friendly and hospitable. And within his family, he was affectionate and indulgent. He was distinguished for great integrity of character and for an inviolate regard for truth." I want to give you a letter. Dear you, thank you for your caring nature. Thank you for wanting to learn and to become a better person. You make a great, big, important, positive impact on everybody around you. What a lucky world to have you in it. You are stronger than you realize. You are more capable than you can even imagine. Go be the very best you. Bring other people to be the very best that they are. Life is great. Why? Because you can think, you can breathe, and you can decide for yourself. Now that's freedom. When was the last time that you wrote a letter recommending or validating someone? Today's your day, and this is that moment. Go write a letter. It really could change the person's whole world. Since the young nation needed a flag to fly, George Ross went to his niece, Betsy Ross, who was an excellent seamstress. He was accompanied by George Washington and Robert Morris, and they asked her to make the American flag. Young Betsy Ross went on to make several American flags for our new country.
George Ross.
George Ross.
George Ross.
George Ross was born in May of 1730 in Newcastle, Delaware, into a very large family. He received a sound classical education at home. Then he proceeded to study law at the office of his older brother John. George attained the bar in Philadelphia at the age of 20 and established his own practice in Lancaster. His political career began in 1768 when he was a representative to the Assembly of Pennsylvania. He was re-elected as a member every year until 1774. At that point, he was appointed to a seat in Congress and asked to report a set of instructions by which the Assembly could redress the American grievances, maintain their American right, and establish that union and harmony which is most essential to the welfare and happiness of both countries, unquote. Ross continued to serve his provincial legislature, was a member of the Committee of Safety for his colony in 1775. It was the circumstances of the state at a committee be appointed which Mr. Ross was on, to report what was needed to be done for the safety of his state. He recommended collecting stores of ammunition and arms to repel any attacks that may be made by British troops. He was also asked to prepare a declaration of rights on behalf of the state for forming rules of order, what should be considered high treason against the state, and the punishment which should be afflicted for that offense. In 1776 and 77, he was elected to the Continental Congress. He was not a member of the Congress when it voted for independence July 2nd. But he was able to sign the Declaration of Independence later on, July 4th, 1776, at the age of 46. He was also serving as a provincial legislator and the colonel in the Continental Army. That year, he also undertook negotiations with the Northwestern Indians on behalf of his colony and took a seat as vice president of the Constitutional Convention for Pennsylvania. Since our young nation needed a flag to fly, George Ross, George Washington, and Robert Morris went to Betsy Ross, who was an excellent seamstress, and asked her to make an American flag. Young Betsy Ross made several American flags for our new country, and she was George Ross's niece. George cheerfully sacrificed his private interest for the public good. Mr. Ross was given a sum of 150 pounds out of the county stock and was requested to accept it as a testimony of thanks from his county. He was told to purchase a plate, ornamented as he thought proper to remain with him as a testimony of the esteem that this county has for him by reason of his patriotic conduct in the great struggle of American liberty. This kindness must have been quite touching to him, but he declined accepting the present. He offered an apology for doing so, stating that he considered it the duty of every man to contribute by every means within his power to the welfare of his country without expecting rewards. On April 14, 1779, he was appointed to the judgeship of the Pennsylvania Court of Admiralty. He was permitted to enjoy that honorable station for a short time. He died in that office in July of the same year from gout at the age of 49. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of George Ross, "As a lawyer, even before the Revolution, he was among the first of his profession, a rank which he continued to hold while he practiced at the bar. As a politician, he was zealous, patriotic, and consistent. As a judge, he was learned and upright and uncommonly skillful in the dispatch of business." George Ross started as a lawyer, became a politician, and ended up as a judge. He kept his eyes and his ears open to the needs all around him. It seems that he was just an all-around good guy who did what was needed to be done. Now that's a good example.